Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Psychedelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicines, to get rid of the myths, and to change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is Brom Rector. Brom spent 7 years as a portfolio manager and quantitative researcher, most recently as global macro portfolio manager at Crable Capital Management, a quant fund with 9 billion assets under management. Now, after leaving Crable in 2020, Brom started a podcast that covers the psychedelics industry from an investing, scientific, and cultural impact perspective. The research that went into this podcast, called the Brom Podcast, and the connections it established laid the groundwork for what would become Empath Ventures, which Brom founded and is currently the general manager of. Empath Ventures is a VC fund that invests in early-stage psychedelics startups. And as you'll see, this is why he has a lot to say about today's topics. Brom, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. It's a pleasure.
I'm excited to have you here. Now, Brom, we're addressing questions today about the true economic motivations and impact behind the psychedelic movement and those that oppose it. I always keep it real, and I try to be honest.
Let's keep it real.
Thank you. Keep me real, too. The healthcare field that the psychedelics industry, particularly as it moves towards decriminalization and hopefully, or at least possibly towards legalization, is a major economic player throughout the Western world, but particularly in the United States. And it has a reputation, especially among common people like me that aren't experts in the field, as having more than its fair share of bad actors. We've had on this show some great guests who have talked about the amazing scientific and therapeutic implications of psychedelic therapy. But someone's gonna be funding this. Someone's gonna be making money off of it. This is going to impact this healthcare economy. Am I crazy for being scared?
Scared about the impact of money, scared about, what specifically do you think is the big concern there? Is it mostly just that money kind of gets in the, money gets mixed up with motivations, and then all of a sudden people are trying to, maximize profits rather than maximize healing? If that's your fear, I think it's, pretty rational. I think that there are definitely reasons to be scared about that, right? But I think luckily, a lot of the people that are working in the psychedelic space oftentimes have a long-standing personal connection with psychedelics and a long-standing respect for psychedelic medicine. And I think that by and large, although there are of course exceptions, most of the people in the space are generally good actors that have, pure intentions.
Couldn't someone say that about the existing healthcare industry though? You want to be a doctor because you want to help someone.
Yeah.
You want to go into the pharmaceutical industry because you actually care about being part of coming up with some cure to cancer. And the next thing you know, you jacked up drug prices, especially here in the United States, to such an extent that almost no one can have access to it. And any change to the way that drugs are distributed in our society, or any change in the relationship with the hospital or medical industry, could have huge economic ramifications.
Yeah.
How do we square that away? How can we say just because those that are good actors now in the psychedelic industry won't necessarily have a change of heart once some big money is behind it, or once this begins to expand and people without such good intentions get involved?
Well, I think the big thing that keeps psychedelic pharma in check, Scott, is the existence, whether you want to call it like the local markets, the decriminalized markets, the recreational illegal markets. So what I mean by that is when you contrast psychedelic medicine with traditional medicine, traditional medicine is pretty much controlled entirely by big pharma, right? Like there's no way to get a lot of these pharmaceuticals outside of big pharma. That's really the one option. With psychedelics, it's kind of this backwards approach where we've actually started with access to these drugs outside of the pharmaceutical system. Now we're trying to get them developed into pharmaceuticals, but not exclusively as pharmaceuticals. So the way that I see it in the future is you might have your pharmaceutical version of psilocybin, or you might have some novel psychedelic molecule that is a pharmaceutical, but that's going to end up coexisting with, first of all, the mushrooms that people today are like growing for personal use, and that in the future states like Oregon and Colorado and California will probably have, whether it's decriminalized, whether it's medicalized in the same way that they medicalized weed, even though it was never through the pharmaceutical industry, and maybe even recreationally legalized psychedelics. So there's always going to be, I think, another option, which means that the pharmaceutical companies that are turning psychedelics into pharmaceutical products are never going to have like a full-on monopoly like they do with standard drugs. So I think that should provide like hope for anyone who's concerned about, pharma's influence over psychedelics, because there's always going to be another option, right?
Well, I want it to give me hope. Yet that little dragon in the back of my brain can't help but still have a little bit of fear around this. And the reason for that is this is the scenario that I see. Sometimes it seems as though changes to the healthcare system or to the medical distribution system in our society, people might have as ideas as they begin to move through whatever legal or regulatory infrastructures are in place to make those things actually happen and safe and subject to the appropriate government oversight. Sometimes it seems like the pharmaceutical industry or various medical interest groups have captured the very agencies that are regulating them.
Sure.
And so even if there are attempts to perhaps equalize the access that Americans in particular might have to pharmaceuticals or to change the ways in which they're distributed, ultimately those that stand to gain the most from a profit perspective, i.e. these pharmaceutical industries, find a way to kill it. And that's what I'm a little bit afraid of here. For instance, let's just talk briefly about mushrooms. And I don't mean to talk over you. I just want to just get this out as an example so the audience can understand. What if, for instance, this fact that we could grow mushrooms at home while at the same time conceivably having pharmaceutical grade mushrooms were to happen, but then the pharmaceutical industry or some other industry bad actor were to gradually put legal squeezes making it impossible for people to grow mushrooms at home without huge risk? How would we navigate and manage that sort of situation?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Obviously, if you're a pharmaceutical company that's trying to create a pharmaceutical version of psilocybin, you're certainly incentivized to do what you can to stop the legalization of mushrooms from happening, right? You're kind of incentivized to use the powers that you have, use the money you have, use the influence you have to stop that. But I think it's going to be a tough sell. I mean, especially given the fact that the state level and like legislative actions around psychedelics seem to be moving a lot faster than like the pharmaceutical stuff is happening. So in Oregon, as you probably know, starting in 2023, therapists are going to be able to use mushrooms as part of a therapy in Oregon. This is totally outside of what the FDA is allowing. This is like kind of their own thing, right? It looks like Colorado is going to be voting on a ballot measure at the end of this year in November that would allow much more increased access to psychedelics, especially plant-based psychedelics in Colorado. Best case scenario for like FDA approval of psilocybin is probably late 2024, 2025. So it's almost like, I think they're going to kind of be beaten to market. And that's going to make people, there's going to be sort of a shift in the popular conception or consciousness, if you will, around how people should be able to access plant medicines and psychedelics. And I think it's going to be hard for people to just accept, any efforts by big pharma or any other or big, evil organizations that are trying to restrict access. What I think will end up happening is that we'll sort of have like a bifurcation of psychedelic healthcare. What will likely happen is that there will be sort of these like state level, local, maybe recreational or maybe medicinal markets where people are just like transacting in plant medicines as they're allowed to do under state law. That will largely be outside of the medical system. And then for people that are very concerned about the idea of doing psychedelics outside of the medical system, maybe people that do have like serious mental health issues and really want to work with like a psychiatrist, those people will end up taking it, using the pharmaceutical versions that insurance can reimburse and can provide like, real mental health, institutional mental health care around or something. I really kind of feel like there's room for both. That's what I hope will happen.
Even with that in mind, actually, before I get into the next question, a lot of folks don't understand the VC world. They might not even really know what the words VC means. I certainly didn't until just a few years ago. I consider myself a somewhat good with acronyms sort of person. So before going any further, can you basically explain what a VC fund is?
Yeah, so VC stands for Vibe Curator. and we curate vibe. No, I'm just kidding. It's VC stands for.
I was gonna say, this conversation was about to seemed like I was on a trip there for a minute.
VC stands for venture capitalist, and what a venture capital fund does is it has a bunch of money that it has raised from investors, and the manager of the venture capital fund basically puts that money to work in small businesses that are just starting out. So they're just like any other investor. They just happen to focus specifically on very, very early stage companies that are just kind of getting off the ground. Companies that are still private, companies that don't have a stock that you can buy or sell on, the NASDAQ or the stock exchange. So in the context of VCs and psychedelics, there are multiple different investment funds out there, one of them being Empath Ventures, that provides capital to companies that are working in the psychedelic space, whether they are trying to develop psychedelics into pharmaceuticals or whether they're trying to launch like a clinic where people are using psychedelics to treat, opiate addiction, or whether they're trying to launch an app that helps facilitate ketamine experience or whatever. We invest in companies all across the different parts of the sort of psychedelics ecosystem.
And for folks that have, let's say you've worked inside a big company your whole life, or maybe you've worked for the government or the educational system or something like that, and you're just not familiar with small business birth and development. The reason why VCs are so important to certain small businesses, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that it can be expensive to start a business. And the sorts of businesses that would likely be in the psychedelic space ain't, just your homeboy or your cousin Sue who's just starting something in her basement. There's going to be staff that needs to be hired. There may be research, insurance, a whole host of technology, literally physical facilities, and other things that may need to be put into place that VCs can provide that money for, that an individual might not just have laying around the house.
Right. And it's especially important for businesses that just due to their business model don't have any chance of making any revenues in the near term. Like pharmaceutical companies are a great example of this. If you're trying to develop a drug and get it approved by the FDA, that's a multi-year process. It can take 3, 5, 7, 10 years to actually go from the beginning of the research process to actually getting the drug approved. And until you get the drug approved, you can't actually sell it. So you're basically not making any money for, 5, 7, 10 years. And in the meantime, you have to pay your staff, you have to do your research, et cetera. And that's where the investors generally come in.
And the investors are generally seeking to get involved in a particular small business because they believe there is at least a possibility that it will grow and ultimately bring in a return on the investment that they made in that company.
This is correct, yes.
Now, the stereotype of VC funds, for those that know a little bit about them, is that they want massive returns on their investment. Really, anyone would, but VCs in particular sort of have that reputation. Is that a fair characterization, or does it vary VC by VC?
In general, so the reason that sort of stereotype or that type of thinking exists is because when you're investing in businesses that are just starting out, there's a pretty high failure rate. Something like 80 to 90% of new businesses fail within the first 2 or 3 years, which means that you really need a couple of companies that you invest in to do really, really well to make up for the losses that you incur on the other companies. That's kind of why that sort of thinking generally exists within the VC mindset. That doesn't mean that we only invest in companies that we think can be $100 billion companies, but yeah, there has to be some upside potential for sure.
And thank you for your candor about that. The reason, you can imagine where this is going, which is that, if VCs are willing to put out the sort of money that could fund a company for, let's say, up to a decade, and it's not impossible to imagine that in the psychedelic space, it literally might be that. I mean, who knows what sort of regulatory burdens
let's
alone.
Hope not for all of our sakes,
and that's a whole other discussion that we can and we should and we would have. I think that's going to be very interesting. We'll get to that later. But I think that, the cynical part of me might say, well, is it really true what he's saying, that there might be this balance? And is it really in his interest to be saying this, or am I being told something just to sort of placate me? Because at the end of the day, for you to maximize the return on your investment, and not just you, obviously, but other venture capital funds that might be investing in this space, they're going to want there to be the largest market possible, which again sort of goes back to this point about this sort of homeboy or sort of side market being squeezed out of existence.
Yeah. Well, I certainly don't want the side market being squeezed out of existence, and I think that any investors that do are definitely being short-sighted. So one of the things that we try to do at Empath is kind of really focus our investing activities on companies that are going to be able to coexist and ideally co-thrive, meaning actually be more successful in the presence of non-medical access. And so when I talk about companies like that, what I mean are companies that are not necessarily focused on the drug development, but are maybe more focused on like the infrastructure and accessories around psychedelics. So one example of that I can point to is we invested in a company called WavePaths. And what WavePaths does is long story short, basically it's a software platform that generates like customized soundtracks for psychedelic experiences that can be adjusted in real time based on how the person is responding. It was based off of a bunch of scientific research that was done at Imperial College London, which is one of the top scientific research institutions. If you imagine a company whose business is like selling this like music for psychedelic therapy, the more people tripping, the more money they can make, right? So like you wouldn't want to restrict it to just people that are accessing it through the medical system. They'll make money through like the pharmaceutical version, but they can also launch a direct-to-consumer app that can be used by people like doing mushrooms in their backyard, you know? So those are examples of like business models that kind of will actually benefit, not just be able to tolerate, but benefit from the maximum amount of people being able to access psychedelics as possible. We've also invested in, companies like Quantified Citizen, which are apps that allow you to track your microdosing habits, do some sort of like, what'd you call it? Like a battery of sort of tests to see how well your microdosing is actually improving your performance, your perception, your reaction time, et cetera, and allows you to really dial in like your microdosing practice. Cause anyone who's ever microdosed knows it's pretty hard to get right. A company like that is going to do better the more people that are actually using psychedelics, right? If it's a more smaller group of people, they're not going to have as many users. So a lot of the companies we invest in are focused on having the biggest market possible, whether we're talking pharmaceutical or whether we're talking non-pharmaceutical, I guess we could call it. And then when it comes to investing in the companies that are doing drug development, one of the big things that I think is important is to just not invest in the companies that are working with the classic psychedelics. So we wouldn't invest in a company whose main business model was, we're going to get psilocybin approved for depression, because that is kind of in conflict with this idea of having this like side market available. We generally invest in companies that are trying to invent new psychedelics, because those are generally not in conflict with the existing ones. And we've also invested in some companies that are doing research on compounds that are slightly outside of the realm of standard psychedelics like Kana and other things.
And just to explain, what exactly are those things and what do they look like and how are they different from psychedelics?
So man, there are a lot of different reasons why you might want to investigate like inventing a new psychedelic. So the classic psychedelics like mushrooms and LSD are quite amazing, and I'm a big fan of them personally, but they're certainly not for everyone, and they're certainly not for every situation. For example, most of these psychedelics do cause some increase in heart rate and blood pressure. There have been some studies that show that people are at a higher risk of having a heart attack in like the 7 days following a trip, and that's especially exacerbated when you look at older populations. For that reason, the FDA has excluded people that have like history of heart conditions from participating in psychedelic clinical trials, which may not be a big deal for like me or you, but a lot of older folks have mental health issues. In fact, older folks are prescribed antidepressants at a higher rate than any other demographic, and they also happen to have higher rates of heart issues. So like, can you make a psychedelic that doesn't have those negative cardiovascular side effects that is more safer for that patient population? That's like an example of some research that might be being done by some of these companies.
Before we go any further, thank you for reminding me that I'm not older. I love that. I was thinking about that exact word as I was looking at the gray in my beard. Anyway,
I'm starting to get it too. No worries.
We won't talk about that. Maybe there'll be a psychedelic cure for that
there
somehow.
You go. I actually do think there's an intersection between psychedelics and longevity and anti-aging.
Whoa, let's talk about that for a minute then. Are you investing in any companies that are walking down that road?
So there's one company we invested in that has like some side projects focused on it, but the main sort of thought process here is psychedelics have been shown to be extremely powerful anti-inflammatories. Okay, pretty much every psychedelic has insanely powerful anti-inflammatory effects. And inflammation seems to be upstream from a lot of things that we associate with aging. Everything from like cancer to Alzheimer's to all these other neurodegenerative diseases. Inflammation seems to be associated in some way with them. And so this is all theoretical, right? This is not proven, but this idea that like maybe you can harness the anti-inflammatory nature of psychedelics to at least slow the process of aging.
I'll remember that once I finally turn 27. Thank you.
There you go. Yeah, you got a few years before you have to start worrying about it,
Now, let me get back to what I was thinking about before you took us down this very, very exciting little rabbit hole there for a minute. So, Brom, one other thing that I've got to ask you a little bit more about before we get into a different series of questions. You want, as much as many folks like me may have these sinister feelings about the healthcare or the pharmaceutical industries, when people have attempted to make change to them, the reaction has been hostile. And my suspicion is that a lot of that hostility, some of that is industry generated, some of it is legit. There might be concern that folks have that due to the sheer size of the healthcare economy in the United States, again in particular, but probably across the entire Western world, that any changes to the healthcare economy could cause that economy to shrink, which would in turn lead to more significant shrinkage or risk to the larger economy. Now, we could talk a little bit about whether that's true or not. I don't pretend to be an expert in the space, but one thing that I am hearing embedded in what you were talking about a minute ago is that the psychedelic renaissance that we may be on the cusp of right now, or maybe even in the beginning of, could actually expand the economy if we're talking about whole new supportive industries, whole new classes of employees, whole new inventions, whole new areas, R&D. That seems like that fundamentally changed the healthcare economy in a way that's explosive, particularly if the bad actors are constrained. But am I just being fantasist here?
No, I don't think you are. I think that this psychedelic renaissance opens up a lot of potential, business opportunities far beyond just the idea of taking psilocybin for depression. Lots of research that can be done, psychedelics for longevity. And then the real big expansion is once we move past the medical phase and into the more recreational experiential phase. I mean, look at how big cannabis has gotten. Imagine something like that, but across the world of psychedelic drugs.
Well,
massive potential.
And that is something that is also of interest to me. There is a great book I read called Bowling Alone. And it's the seminal book on the decline in interpersonal connection, particularly among younger people in Western culture, again, mostly the United States, but a lot of these trends are observed elsewhere. Then there is, related to that, an entire body of data around the shifting role of organized religion in our culture, shifting in that attendance is by and large down, not universally, but across large swaths of the population, including and especially younger people. At the same time, at least in theory, the need that people have for spirituality is probably not going away. Just because people aren't associated with a particular religion doesn't necessarily mean they have no interest in spirituality at all. And I raise that because part of the psychedelic experience, and I haven't done psychedelics yet, so I'm not an expert in this, but part of the psychedelic experience that I've understood so far is that there is a profound spiritual component to many people's trips. And let's face it, even in its declining state, religion is a major, organized religion in particular, is a major economic actor.
It's a big business. You're right. I mean, actually, the reason that I wanted to try psychedelics in the first place was because I was curious about the spiritual benefits. It wasn't for any sort of mental health thing. Mm-hmm. I was raised Christian and then rebelled against that as a teenager. And then my early 20s actually did exactly what you were just describing. I was like, is there a way that I can throw some spirituality into my life without having to believe in or participate in any sort of organized religion? And of course I found psychedelics, and that was what made me try them the first time. And since then I've recognized the mental health benefits and everything. So I guess your question is there going to be sort of like a spiritual economy around psychedelics? I think maybe is that kind of what your question is?
That's certainly where putting all of these different puzzle pieces together, pathway seems to potentially be emerging.
Yeah, I think for sure. In fact, if you look at what does like the psychedelic economy look like now on the underground, it is largely based on spirituality and connection, even if people don't see it that way, right? Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people go to festivals like Burning Man or to, Lightning in a Bottle, and they do psychedelics with their friends in a group setting where there are a lot of people that are all sort of focused on the same sort of energy, whether that energy be a DJ or whether that energy be some sort of art installation at Burning Man or something.
Right.
So this is kind of what people are already doing, whether you think about it that way or not. If you go back even further to some of the more, ancient indigenous traditions. A lot of it was healing for sure, but it was generally community-based healing and ritualized. So I think kind of a hybrid between therapeutic but also spiritual, which the Western world maybe views as two different things, but in practice are probably a lot more similar than you might think. So I think that there will be that in the future. I've already seen some companies start to do research around like group psychedelic therapy. There are some ketamine clinics that offer group ketamine sessions. There's a lot of people that have discussed this idea of, when it comes to the integration component of psychedelics, which is what you do after the experience when you actually talk about it and try to understand what happened during the experience and try to work that into your life, that can often be more beneficial in a group context than solo. So yes, connection and spirituality, I think, are going to play a big part in the psychedelic revolution going forward.
One of the issues that motivated this in the first place, this being the WebDelics podcast and WebDelics itself, is that we, throughout the Western world, are dealing with what you mentioned a minute ago, Brom, a lot of mental health challenges, right? We have declining longevity rates in some populations because of things like suicide, and that's not even considering other loneliness or depression or mental health related challenges where people might be dying or otherwise disengaged from the workforce due to issues that are on the surface something else, but may at a minimum be related to things like mental health dis-ease, or a whole other host of other problems that are related to this. Also, we have a population that's aging and maybe dealing with some of these later in life mental health issues that a lot of folks find challenging. I can't help but be curious then, listening to everything that you're saying and thinking about the economic impact of a psychedelic industry that burgeons, is whether really a potential reason to root for this renaissance to succeed is that if we are able to pull large numbers of people out of disengagement from production in society, or just from society itself, the economy would expand by that alone. If we have people that aren't fully engaged at work, or if are dying early, or are being distracted by mental health issues that they or their family members might be having, it's hard to believe that if there wasn't a mass re-engagement, if psychedelics became a more routinized and more common and accepted way for people to deal with things, that the economy itself wouldn't grow. But am I being a starry-eyed optimist?
No, I mean, in some sense, you're right. And it's been a while, but I've seen articles and studies that talk about, like, we lose, however many billions, maybe even $1 trillion in potential GDP per year due to just people that have mental health issues, right? Like you said, people that are not fully engaged at work because they're anxious or depressed, et cetera. Now, I don't know that that is a primary reason that you should vote for psychedelics. I don't like this idea that, like, we want people to be healed from their mental health issues just so they can make more money for the economy. But it's certainly, that's a little bit dystopian. But it's certainly like, undeniably potentially a positive side effect of psychedelics becoming a more mainstream part of the culture, and people's mental health at large improving, right? So yeah, I think it's certainly a positive benefit.
You got me feeling like a dark overlord there for the first time in my life.
Yeah. Take your ketamine so you can produce more. Come on.
Right. Get to work, Brom.
Quit slacking off. Take your medicines.
Now, let me ask you, in this new economy we are imagining, in which psychedelic industries, side by side, the regulated healthcare one and the sort of underground or less regulated economy are both thriving, outside of my homie down the street, where would these drugs be coming from? And how can, particularly if there is this side-by-side economy that isn't as regulated, how would people know in that economy whether anything would be safe? And to what extent would that impact how all of this really plays out in the world?
Yeah, so just to be clear, what I'm hoping will happen in the long run is that we'll have basically recreational legalization, which means that you would go into a dispensary. I live in Los Angeles. Within like a 5-minute walk of my apartment, there are like 5 cannabis dispensaries where I can buy weed that I know is just weed without anything else in it, right, and is safe. Yeah. I'm hoping that's what we get to, at least when it comes to the plant-based psychedelics, so mushrooms, et cetera. Those are things that can be grown very easily. They're not like some mysterious powder. I'm certainly not advocating that we continue keeping, the sale and production of this stuff underground. It does get a bit trickier when you talk about the synthetic psychedelics like LSD and, ketamine. Yeah. It requires a lot of skill to be able to manufacture those things at high scale. And that's where, that pharmaceutical level of precision, I think, does come in handy. But at the very least, when it comes to the plant-based psychedelics, I'm hoping that we can just have a system very similar to what we have for cannabis now.
Gotcha. And in terms of mass production of these drugs, then the resources, particularly if we're talking about inventing entire new classes of psychedelics, the resources that companies might be spending on other mental health treatments, the more traditional ones, either would be expanded into this new space and production of them may look more or less like the existing ones that we have, or perhaps if they're more effective, even ultimately displace some of those.
It might displace some of them, but I think in general, it's like when you're trying to invent a new psychedelic, it's usually you're trying to fill some gap that the existing psychedelics have. You're not necessarily trying to replace it. You're trying to say like, okay, maybe we can make this better for a certain population or something, or maybe we can make something similar to psilocybin that doesn't last as long. So if you're someone who only has a couple of hours to have an experience, you can take that instead of psilocybin. So I don't really see them as competition as much as I see them as companions, I guess.
Brom, let's really get into the realm of fantasy here.
All right, let's get into the fantasy realm. Let's go.
We're going to do some total Lord of the Rings imagining.
Oh boy.
So, what if every psychedelic company that Empath invests in succeeds?
Okay.
What is the world that we are living in which that happens looking like, particularly from an economic and specifically a healthcare economy perspective? But in any other ways that you might be thinking about too.
Yeah, well, it would be a very interesting world for sure. There would be an entire universe of potential psychedelic therapies that could be accessed depending on not just what your issue that you're trying to solve is, whether it's depression, anxiety, or PTSD, but what your preferences for treatment are. I think it's important. We've invested in a lot of companies that are kind of working on things for similar issues, right? Like multiple different approaches for depression, multiple different approaches for anxiety or PTSD. And all of those options would be available to someone so that they can find the best option that is like best for them. Which I think is a positive thing in general, right? Like we don't want to tell people that there's a single solution and that if the solution doesn't work for you, that's your problem. We want to have like lots of different options so that people can try different things, find what works for them. Outside of mental health, I think we might have some potential, I'm trying to think of what I'm allowed to say here in terms of what's like secret and whatnot. I would say that your sex life might be a bit enhanced based on some of the things that we've been working on.
We'll maybe some
maybe some other non-mental health issues as well might be solved. But yeah, the mental health stuff first and foremost, definitely some interesting sexual dysfunction stuff that we've been looking at, and the broader class of inflammation as well. Outside of the drugs, though, like I said, we've invested in some companies that are doing some very, very cool stuff with music to enhance psychedelic trips. We also invested in a company that is currently operating using certain psychedelic drugs to help people get off of opiates. So hopefully the opiate crisis is over. And yeah, I think that covers it.
There was a song from the 90s that I love that keeps running through my head. Life, love, and happiness.
There you go. Life, love, and happiness.
And more seriously, some real challenges that folks are facing, them having options around. Is there anything, a single thought, maybe recapping what you said earlier, or something that you haven't had a chance to say so far that you'd like to leave our audience with as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of recognize that psychedelics are becoming a thing. Whether you realize that or not, they're going to be a part of the healthcare system. There is money involved. That's not something we really have like an option to decide whether we want it to be that way or not. And that kind of is what it is. If you are investing in the psychedelic space, try and do so with some sort of ethical filter. Don't invest in companies that are pursuing, short-term profits at the expense of, healing.
Thank you.
And follow me on Twitter at @TheRealBrom.
Look, anytime a guest comes on this show and they have a voice that is as good for radio as mine, if I might say so, I know people are going to follow them. At least they're going to be curious. So how can people find out more about you, Brom?
Yeah, so you can find my venture fund, Empath Ventures, at empath.vc. You can follow me on Twitter at @TheRealBrom. Brom is spelled Brom. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well. Brom Rector is the name. And I think that pretty much covers it.
Excellent. And that information is all going to be in the show notes.
Yep.
Brom, I've got to say, it has been great having you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight and your wisdom. It's been revelatory.
Hey, thank you so much, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
Now, for those of you who are listening or watching, keep tuning in, because in upcoming episodes, we're going to be touching a little bit more deeply on some of the things that Brom and I sideswiped today. Religion and psychedelics, for instance, and public policy and psychedelics are some issues that we are going to be addressing in much more depth in episodes that are right around the corner. And if you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review or a comment, and tell folks that you care about what we're doing. Also, don't forget to follow Webdelics on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And also, check out our website at webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. And sign up for our blog for information that you can trust about plant medicine and psychedelics. And then join us next time for another episode of the Webdelics Podcast.